So the Sega Saturn doesn't get a whole lot of love on the Leftover Culture review, but this is the third console that I ever added to my own collection, so I thought I'd take some time, talk about what makes it so special for me, and why you might want to add it to your collection too. I might not shout it from the tops of buildings, but that's just because my mum doesn't want me getting too high in case I slip and fall. But I really love this console, and there's a few good reasons why the Sega Saturn is an awesome machine. It's the bad boy that walked in front of the PlayStation while it was taking a whiz, ended up getting some piss on its jeans and slipping in the puddle. I'll admit, I played a lot more PlayStation as a younger bruiser, but this is the console that I wanted. You saw games like Panzer Dragoon. You heard the Sega marketing machine making an awesome case, and even kids have brand loyalty.
Reality always hurts.
Welcome to the real world, Sega Saturn.
And coming from the Sega Mega Drive, this is the console that was the obvious step up. But even my parents knew it was flopping really hard. But looking back at it all, I still remember those old Sega arcade units at places like the mall or in the cinema. Games like Daytona USA and Virtua Cop, and thinking, man, I could have had those games at home. So the Sony PlayStation did eventually get some games that could compete with the Sega arcade titles. But in my area, those Sega products were plastered everywhere, followed closely by the Namco arcade machines. And that's always been the appeal for me here. The Sega Saturn always felt a bit more hungry. Here, we have a console that didn't quite match up with the competition specs or budget. Sega was hurting a bit after the 32X and the Sega CD, and I like to think that's reflected in the games we got for this system. Heaps of ports from Sega's arcade division, some of the very beginnings of the 3D revolution, and exclusive titles that burned brightly like one-hit wonders. And looking back now, they left a pretty distinctive impression. No one can deny that as the Saturn support waned, the PlayStation was only getting bigger and better. It was pushing itself further than ever. I will always have a pretty special spot for the Saturn. By the time the Dreamcast was finished, a lot of those exclusive titles like Sonic Adventure found a home on other consoles like Nintendo's GameCube. Not so with the Saturn. And sure, the Dreamcast does have some great exclusive titles too, but the Saturn was really the only place to play its hit games. And yeah, things have started to change with the PlayStation Network, the Virtual Network and the Xbox Arcade, but for a lot of those original 32-bit Sega exclusives, you can still only find them on the Sega Saturn. And for those of us who care, the Saturn was still rocking 2D a lot harder than the PlayStation ever did. I don't want to get into the technical specs of what each system is capable of. We can pretend each system handled 2D just as well as each other, but it's obvious that 2D is still a major staple in the Saturn gamer's diet, and more dev time was dedicated to accurately recreating that 2D experience, while Sony were stemming the flow of those 2D games. And Earthworm Jim 2 is a great example of that happening. While the PlayStation was advancing 3D graphics, which definitely was the future, the Sega Saturn was proudly supporting the 2D tradition. And look, that is not to say that Sega was solely relying on their 2D games. Virtua Fighter is arguably the first fighting title to use actual polygons all the way back in 1993. Naturally, these breakthrough arcade games made their way to the Sega Saturn, while games like Tekken, developed on PlayStation hardware for the arcades and the consoles, were still playing catch-up. It is pretty common knowledge that Sega shot themselves in the foot when they released the Saturn early without the proper support, but one game that's been there since day one is Virtua Fighter, a game that can truly show off what the Saturn was capable of doing. The Virtua Fighter series really flourished on the system, and we actually ended up with something close to Sega's version of the King of Fighters, in the Fighters Megamix, starring heaps of different Sega characters. Some of them were pretty outrageous, and with some of the best graphics available on the Saturn. And look, pretty much the same story with Virtua Cop, bringing polygons to rail shooters in 1994. Ported straight across to the Sega Saturn while PlayStation owners again were playing catch-up waiting for Time Crisis. Sega knew how to make an awesome arcade game, and Virtua Cop is still as fun as ever, mostly because the gameplay is simple and straightforward. But seriously, a great shooting game comes down to great hardware. The Sega Saturn Stunner. Really heavy weight. They actually belong in an arcade, and I've seen something very similar used for the House of the Dead 2 cabinets. I don't know how many peripherals got this kind of love and attention, but the fact it's all straight out of Sega probably helped. And it is really easy to dismiss the Sega Saturn as some kind of accident that didn't really help Sega's position at all. The Sega CD and 32X already struck a pretty massive blow, and after a successful system like the Mega Drive, of course expectations were going to be high. Plenty of competition appeared and disappeared really quickly throughout the early 90s. The CDI, the 3DO, the Atari Jaguar. But this is the console that actually started to sort of shape Sega's direction going forward with their arcade titles. When pitted against systems like the Sony PlayStation and even the upcoming Nintendo 64, I just don't feel like the Sega Saturn really made the impact that it needed to survive. So here in Australia, we got these nice rounded controllers, really close to the Mega Drive controllers. But when it comes to actually controlling the Saturn, I am a real sucker for these 3D controllers. This is the game that actually came bundled with the 3D controller, and for a lot of people, the entire reason that the Sega Saturn is even worth mentioning today. Straight from the Sonic team, Nights into Dreams shows off a side to the Saturn that actually gave people so much hope for an actual Sonic game. It's bright, colourful and liquid smooth, with some real imaginative design. And it is often paraded as one of the most defining titles for the Sega Saturn. One of the best things about collecting for the Saturn is you can't really fake it. Virtual console support isn't really there yet, and the emulators are mostly rubbish. I mentioned a few of the ports, but there's a few games out there you just can't play without an actual Saturn. Of course, picking up a Game Shark or Pro Action Replay opens up a whole import market to explore. It's obvious that the Saturn had a lot more fanfare in the Japanese market, but there will be a language barrier. I wish I could go into more detail for you, but I'm more of a casual collector, and I just don't feel like I'm qualified to tackle the import Saturn market here. The best thing about this being a retrospect is we can remember the experience as a whole. Remember the good games, forget about the duds, and try not to remember that most of the third-party titles came out better and cheaper for the PlayStation. Anyway, thanks for watching.